everyone. Welcome to Cafecito with Kitzia and Nabil, the last portion of our Latinidad, mental health, and young people series. My name is Dr. Kitzia Moreno Garza. I'm a psychologist, and I'm also this year's BIPOC Research Fellow at the Springtide Research Institute. Today, we're going to be wrapping up our entire series on Latinidad, young people, and mental health. So, we're going to be joined by Dr. Nabil Dueme and
Hola, doctora. Can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. Hola.
How are you? I've got my cafecito ready.
You and me both.
Well, I'm so excited to talk to you because we've had so many great things happening this week, and it's nice to just kind of be able to chat and debrief and sum things up and maybe answer any questions that people might have.
Yeah, that sounds really wonderful. It has been a week filled with a whole lot of information. We've got blogs, we've got Psychology Today posts, we had speakers, quite a few of them. And so I think a space to kind of settle any questions that people might have and also kind of talk about what this process was like and other things along the way, I think is a good way to wrap up.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to start because we were planning a lot to make this week happen for Mental Health Awareness Month and for Mental Health Action Day with MTV. So I'm kind of curious, like, why focus on Latinidad and mental health this week? Where did that idea come from? What kind of inspired you to do this? And yeah, just kind of like a little behind the scenes. I'd love that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, it actually started when I was trying to figure out what to do for school. So for a long time, I grew up in a family where like success was education. So the expectation was already that I was gonna go to school. My parents were both from Mexico, and that was like the clear path. That part wasn't an option, but what to do in school was the big question mark. And I think more and more when I was growing up, I saw that mental health wasn't really a part of the conversation.
Mhm.
And I think when I started to notice that it was like mental illness, not necessarily mental health. And so for me, that was a passion that I really pursued and decided, like, hey, I'm going to go this route. And along the way, all of my professors were white. All of the content, like all of the people who like wrote our books, the people that we were learning from, the people who created some of like the big theories in psychology were white. And being Spanish speaking, the clients that I actually started working with, probably 99% of them were only spoke Spanish. And there were some like interventions that just didn't fit for the way that these families functioned and lived through the world. And so then that became like an interest of mine. Like, are the things that we're actually doing, do they even fit for the people that I'm working with more specifically? And that's where my research started. So a lot of my research has been on looking at like Latinidad, culture, and how that impacts not just behavior, but mental health too, because all of that is so closely intertwined. And so when I had, the privilege of coming into Springtide as y'all's BIPOC research fellow, and I think almost verbatim what I heard from y'all was like, what do you want to do? We'll make it happen. And to have that as such a like big, broad, like pursue your passion, we'll support you along the way, along with like the research y'all were already doing, I think it was a wonderful way for this to come together. Because oftentimes what I would hear when y'all would give presentations is people would ask like, okay, now what do I do? How do I have my parents have this conversation with me? How do I have these conversations with my kids? Faith leaders that were like, okay, how do I know when people should get mental health help? And to be able to bring in people to speak to those pieces, those questions that come up from y'all's research, I think was really like at the core of this. Like, how can we give people the answers that they're asking of us from people who have been doing this work?
Yeah. Yeah, that's been really, really cool to see how people bring in the diversity of like where they're coming from, what kind of practice they do, right? We had Dr. Lisa Fortuna, who's not only a psychiatrist, but she's also an ordained Episcopal priest, We had a panel of young people from, born here, from Mexico, from Nicaragua, like second gen, third gen. Like there's just so many different ways, so many different ways to be Latina, right? And so many different things we bring to the table. And I love this kind of narrative that I saw woven throughout, which is like, it's not a one size fits all. And so bringing in all of those experiences to really think holistically about mental health it's been really cool to learn about. So I'm kind of curious, like, as you take stock of this week and all of the different voices we heard, right? We also had that Instagram live yesterday with Adriana and Leslie from Latinx Parenting and Latinx Therapy. That was so cool. And Adriana obviously has that amazing directory of Latinx therapists, which, going back to like what resources have historically been present for our comunidades, like that hasn't, it hasn't historically been so easy to access. So really opening access that way is really amazing. And I've benefited tremendously from her work. But what are some of the things that you heard this week that were like really cool or surprising or unexpected that you want to just kind of shout out today?
Yeah. I think there's two that really stand out. I'll start with our Instagram conversation from yesterday because I think oftentimes when we have the conversation about like just mental health, like before we even boil it down to Latinidad, when we have conversations around mental health, there is such a big component of like you heal through therapy or through self care, and this is what self care should look like. And that's just like often the rhetoric that comes up in these conversations. And a lot of it has to do with like where the conversations are happening, right? Who's having those conversations? Obviously, like we have a bias as like therapists and psychologists to be like, therapy's the thing that fixes it all. But I think it was just like a really beautiful reminder yesterday and a really important piece to bring into the conversation. The healing happens in a whole lot of different ways. I think one of the examples that Leslie gave, which really tied to this, was like Cafecito with my comadre is like healing, right? Like I can leave that feeling just as good as I can leave therapy feeling. And I think that's a really important part to highlight because it's so true and it's so cool. And there's so many things that are built into the way that we connect with our culture, that we connect with our religion, that we connect with our spirituality that is already healing. And it doesn't necessarily have to happen in the therapy vacuum. Like it's okay for healing to happen in other places. So I would say that's one of the biggest things that was really interesting for me today. I mean, across this week. And the other is just that the entire SAP interview, like the interview with our young people, because man, like the things that they have to share are so powerful. And oftentimes it's us, like it's adults telling other adults what young people are saying without letting those young people speak for themselves. It just happens all too often. And so to get to interview them and to hear their insight, because they are such insightful young people, I think that was probably the piece that touched my heart the most, to really hear through them what it's like to live this and what they need from the adults in their lives, because who to tell it better than them?
Yeah, I was really struck by that conversation we had with the panel of young people. Like the the way they talk about mental health, the courage they had, the vulnerability, the power really was so amazing to see. There were so many times in that interview where I was like, or that panel that you had with them, where I was really moved also because I saw a lot of my experiences being reflected. As a daughter of immigrants from Mexico, and also struggling with not necessarily having the mental health language in the past, and how they're able to we've lived experience with some of these psychoeducation things that they've learned, and also, like you said, the resources that they already have internally and the resources that they have in their community that maybe haven't traditionally been understood as healing or therapeutic practices has been cool, really cool. I'm thinking about, like, for example, one young person, Lupita, who said, el baile folclórico que hago, the folkloric dance that I do, that's like a meditative healing practice for me. That was really cool to see. Um, Well, so you mentioned the Instagram live we did yesterday, and we had a lot of people there who were watching. We had a lot of great comments come through. So, I thought I'd kind of mention one of the comments that stood out to me, even though there were a ton of good ones. And we're here together talking. So if other questions come up, I'd love to hear from people who are joining us today. But um, there was one person. Well, one of the themes in the comments was, you know, therapy, mental health care was really stigmatized for me in the past. And so it took me a while to get mental health care for myself. And I want to change that for my children. Um, and and part of changing that, this one viewer said, was um, normalizing talk of mental health. And so I heard that term several times in the Instagram live, normalize, right? So I'm wondering, like, could you give us a little bit of a working definition? Like, what does it mean to normalize something? And maybe even if you have them, like some practical ways that people, trusted adults, anyone can do that normalizing work in the service of our mental health care.
Yeah, definitely. So when we talk about normalizing, or like when we use that word, it really means like there has been something that has been going on in our lives long enough that we don't really question if this is true for other people too.
Mm,
So there's, I think, a lot of different examples that we can think about when it comes to normalizing. But to do like a very tangible one, here, at least, in my family, we refrigerate all of our milk. Like it's just a thing that we do. Like you buy it in a little plastic can and then we put it in the fridge. I think one of the first few times that I was like a cognizant adult paying attention to my surroundings when I was in Mexico, I noticed that their milk came in cartons and
mm,
it wasn't refrigerated. And that was perfectly fine. Like it was fine to drink milk that way. But for me, it was normalized to have it refrigerated. So the first time that I saw that it wasn't, I was like, what's the impact of this? Like, can I drink it? But for them, it would have felt unusual to like come to my house, for that part of the family to come to my house and to see that we have it refrigerated. So it's one of those little things that like sometimes just things happen in our lives, and sometimes it's like really benign things, and sometimes it's really traumatic things.
mm,
And because we don't really have a touch point to see what this looks like in other people's lives, it just becomes normal for
mm,
us. And so I think that's a big piece of that, of how that normalization of things happen.
mm,
And I see it a lot when it comes to not just the families that I work with, but my own family, where when we ask like the checkbox questions of like, oh, is there mental health issues in your family, that the answer is often no. But then as we like ask more questions, it's like, yeah, there's like no mental health issues, but also like we have a history of people struggling with alcohol addiction, we have a history of people struggling with drug addiction. Like there was someone who became like so um for lack of a better word, like anxious that they couldn't like function in the world, and so we just adjusted around it. Those things that become really normal and just become a piece of the story. And when it comes to like getting mental health services, one of the ways that this shows up is in a lot of families we talk about mental health only in terms of like, oh, getting services is for crazy
mm,
people. That's a really big piece of it. But another piece of it too is like la ropa sucia se lava en casa. Like our household stuff is our household
mm,
stuff, and you don't go share that with the world. And that is what's normalized, right? Like we will fix things as a family, and people outside of our home don't have to know what's going on. But so much of therapy is sharing those pieces, right? To the extent that it feels like safe and comfortable for the person in therapy. So when I think about like people who want to do things a little bit different, people who were negatively impacted by not getting therapy because it was normalized to not do that, I think there's a couple of things that can be really helpful when we think about the young people in our care. I think one of those, which this person already highlighted, is like checking in with ourselves about what is making us hesitant about bringing our kids to therapy.
mm,
Like, is this a me thing? And sometimes it is, and it's okay that it is, right? Like, you are also human, and you will also need to like work through the things that are impacting you to be able to serve your kids. So I think one of those pieces is like starting with that question to yourself of what might be bringing that hesitation in ways that are also compassionate.
yeah.
Like in a lot of ways, we soak in what's around us, and we can't know what we haven't been taught, right? And so we can't know how therapy is going to go outside of what we have been taught. So being patient with ourselves, being compassionate, that it's hard to do things differently than what we've been taught. So I think that's the first piece for like adults that are caring for kids or young people. And then I think for young people, one of the really, which I saw in our panel, one of the things that I'm seeing with this younger generation is they just have the language for a whole lot of things already. And they're making meaning of those things along the way. And so I think like them really finding an adult that they can trust with the information that they have, because one of the things that we also know, and I mean, you've probably seen this quite a bit too, is our children are kind of the people with the least rights in the US. Like, if we really think about it, like, they don't have any autonomy over like where they sleep or who they stay with or what they eat or what they can and can't do, even with therapy, right? Like,
Yeah.
parents have to consent to therapy for them to take that on. And so I think in addition with like adults being flexible and questioning, what may make them hesitant to bring their kids to therapy. Kids also finding those adults that they can trust and to feel, and with the hope that we adults can make it feel safe for them to tell us when they need additional support. But also, that it can also be preventative, right? Like, you can be going through the greatest parts of your life and get therapy to process how great those things are going. Like, so much of our world moves really fast. So we just like experience this big wonderful thing, and then like, we go to work on Monday.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay to do therapy to process those things too. Like, man, this felt so good, I want to sit in it a little bit longer, I want to feel what this feels like. And our therapy can be really helpful for that piece of it too.
I love that because I think sometimes that's part of some of the cultural understandings of therapy is that therapy is meant for times of crises and just like extreme versions of crises, and obviously like extreme is so subjective, right? What is considered extreme and what isn't. And so I love the thought of like, no, actually, we can go preventatively. We can go to celebrate the joys in our life and process some of those as well and really be grounded in that moment. And that is tremendously beneficial as well. I feel like that's an approach to therapy that sometimes gets left out. And I love that. And it goes back to, you know, reclaiming some of these internal resources we already have, right? I was thinking about the conversation you had with the panel of young people too, was like taking some of these practices like prayer or dance or being in community. They're helpful for so many different reasons, but one of them is just being grounded, being present. There's like a meditative element to that that can be really therapeutic. So I love that. Well, so I'm wondering, Doctora, like, what key takeaways do you want people to leave this week with? There are so many different things that we did, that you did, right? There was a Psychology Today article. If you haven't read that, definitely go check that out. That has some really great practical ways that non-family adults can become trusted adults in the lives of Latina young people. There's some blog posts that you shared. I know one of them is in Spanish too, or maybe a couple of them is in Spanish, so that's really great. We have the Instagram live, but we also have a bunch of recorded conversations, so that's a lot. What, like, yeah, what are some key takeaways that you'd really love people to leave this week with?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the one that I heard the most, kind of across all settings, which is really hammered home by our panel of young people, which was listen to young people. Like, it sounds so intuitive, it really does. Like, listen to the people in your life. But that's the thing we heard the most of young people just not feeling listened to. And so the things that made them not feel listened to was like them saying something and the other person kind of listening to respond. That was like a big piece that they noticed. Or feeling like the adults in their lives felt like they had to have the answer when sometimes they didn't want an answer. They just wanted someone to listen to what was going on. So I think I'd be, if I didn't start with that point, I just feel like that's the most important one. Like, listen to the young people in your lives. And the blog post, the Psychology Today post, touches on kind of ways to go about doing that, because it can be a little bit harder than we might anticipate. If it's not like a muscle that we usually flex, it might take a little bit of building. I think the other piece, which is for kind of people who serve young people, is that your intentionality in addressing their identities really goes a long way. Like no two young people are going to be the same, and like it's really important to make space for those identities that they do share and to highlight those in the work that you're doing. So I think, to bring up Latinx parenting and Latinx therapy again, their work is really tailored to fitting into the lives of Latinx young people and families and adults. And even they acknowledge, right, that there's nuances in that and they're open to that. So I think for people who serve Latina young people, be intentional about highlighting their identities, letting them see themselves in all of the work that we do, I think is really, really important. And to not be afraid of getting mental health services. Like they're so important, and some people more than others may benefit from going to therapy, from having a space to be listened to process all of the things that they're feeling, and that we're slowly making a path to therapy, and that we're slowly working towards minimizing the stigma that really surrounds it. And a big step towards minimizing that stigma is getting those services. I think that's just one of the biggest pieces. Like we can't know until we're in the room what that's like for us. So I think those are some of the big takeaways that I feel like are repeatedly highlighted throughout the series that we hosted this week.
Well, I love that. And I also really appreciated Adriana from Latinx Therapy when she said, if you are someone who, for whom therapy isn't financially accessible, right? Reach out. You never know, right? If you see the number, the price for how much a session is going to cost, a lot of people are willing to work with you if you talk about your circumstances. If you're someone who can't afford it, right? Especially for, we talk about the fact that there is a great need for Spanish speaking providers, but there aren't that many people out there, right? There are not a lot of people like you out there, Kitzia, and so I know that that presents a great barrier too. But then it's also kind of like from that angle, the people who are out there face their own challenges. So if you're someone who can't afford it, right? This is not for you, right? But if you're someone who can't and you're really excited to have a Spanish speaking provider or BIPOC provider, right? Like you just never know. So reach out. Don't let that be the first barrier, because sometimes there are ways around it. And when it comes to listening, something that I heard as well in the conversation with young people that you had, that I really appreciated was like the compassion for our parents too, right? Sometimes it's easy to be like, oh, they're so cerrados, they don't get it, they're closed-minded, right? But what does it mean to take that first step in acknowledging what you've gone through, right? The challenges that come from leaving your home country, going to a country you don't know, maybe not speaking the language, having to navigate the system and advocate for your children, right? It's hard to have to confront everything you went to because you were in survival mode. So I really also appreciated that compassionate approach of like, actually none of this is as easy as it seems. Like, let's really try to understand each other. So that was something that I really took away from everything too, that I really appreciate, Kitzia. So yeah, is there anything else you want to share with folks, Dr. Morena Garza, before we finish up this week? I know there are some other things, other blog posts that are going to come out later this month, and there are resources on our website as well as social media. But any other kind of lingering thoughts you wanna share?
I think just to touch on what you mentioned with the therapy piece, because sometimes taking that first step is hard, and the first therapist that you reach out to might not be the one for you. And that's really hard too, because a lot of people have bad first experiences, and it does taint what they'll expect the rest of therapy to look like. So I often say that like therapists are like shoes. Like just because a pair is cute and it works for someone else doesn't mean it works for you. It's okay to try out different therapists. And one of the ways to do this is most therapists, for the most part, will like do a free 10 to 15 minute consultation with you on the phone because it can be expensive to pay for a lot of first sessions. But a lot of them will do like a free 15-minute consultation, and you can have some questions that you want to ask them to see if you might be a fit,
Mm,
to see if they work on the things that you want to work on, to kind of screen out who might not be, to save you a little bit of money so you don't have to do a whole
yeah.
bunch of first sessions to realize that you don't fit, you don't click with this person. So I think that's just like a little like tangible thing that is important to think about when we start therapy for the first time, because it's not intuitive.
Yeah,
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think that's one of the pieces that's really
I
important
love
for
that.
people taking that first step. Yeah.
That's great. That's a really great point to make. I've definitely had that experience when I've tried one therapist out. I'm like, this isn't a good fit. It's easy to get discouraged, but and then I found a great one. So you just never know.
Yeah. Take some trial and error.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, like it'd be wonderful if your first one is like the one. But I've also worked with people where like in our first session I was like, oh, this we are not a fit.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's okay. Like not everyone is. Some people will just vibe a little bit better than other people, and
Yeah,
that's fine.
yeah, exactly. I love the analogy you use. I actually love all of your analogies throughout the season. They've been so super helpful with the milk, the ropa sucia, everything. Well, Doctora, thank you so much for all of the work that you do for young people, for young Latinas in particular, and for all of the amazing insight and wisdom that you shared with us this week, but also this year. It's been such a pleasure working with you, and I hope that everyone here will check out some of those great resources on the blog that we have at springtideresearch.org, as well as on social media. And if any other questions arise, feel free to drop those into the comments for this video, or shoot us an email at research@springtideresearch.org. But gracias, doctora. It was amazing having this cafecito with you.
You too. Thank you, Naveen.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.